what has happened between Israel and Hamas, a ceasefire, which was reported by Haaretz as a deal forced by Donald Trump. And many people are now asking, why did the Biden administration not try to do that? They had more than a year of this conflict in Gaza, but they didn't do anything about it.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the Biden administration was mainly focused on supporting Israel rather than doing any kind of negotiations. Antony Blinken is very sympathetic to the Israelis. He's a Zionist. He has no connection to the Palestinians. I think Bill Burns, the CIA director, a very accomplished diplomat, did his best with the instructions he got. But every time there was an agreement with Hamas, Netanyahu would sabotage it. And that was the case. The deal that so-called deal that has finally emerged, and I will explain why I call it a so-called deal, basically is what Biden proposed 6 months ago. Hamas agreed to that then. Netanyahu then added additional conditions. This is the way he acts. You can't make an agreement with him because he will not keep it. He will keep adding conditions. He will charge you with violating the agreement when that charge is baseless, and use that as an excuse to wriggle out of whatever commitment he appeared to have made. So what is interesting is that the Biden administration, which, as I indicated, really I don't think made a serious effort at all, although they claim they did allow Mr. Trump's representative to join the talks. And he very abruptly, almost a week ago, on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, insisted on seeing Mr. Netanyahu. And I guess he spoke pretty bluntly to Mr. Netanyahu, you have to sign on this deal. We're not going to allow you to do what you've continuously done. Mr. Trump positioned himself to do this very adroitly. First, he issued a warning about there will be hell to pay if there's no hostage agreement by the time of my inauguration. That was seen as a warning to Hamas. That was it ingratiated him with the Israel lobby and with the Israeli government, and seemed to forecast a strong pro-Israeli position for his administration. But he then turned around and aired Jeff Sachs' video in which Sachs condemned Netanyahu, in my view correctly, for being dishonest and also for being arrogant and for leading the United States around by the nose. That put Mr. Netanyahu on notice that Mr. Trump was not going to simply follow every dictate that came from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So that set the stage. But typically what has happened, you can already see it, is the usual Israeli practice. If you look back on all of the Israeli negotiations, Camp David, for example, way back when, and more recently, you see a common pattern. Israel will go for the short-term benefits that an agreement provides Israel, and it is prepared to make concessions. So in this case, it has agreed to release people with life sentences in Israeli jails, the Palestinian hostages, in return for the Israeli hostages. That's an immediate benefit for Israel that will help in domestic politics in Israel, and which will make Israel more acceptable to Jewish communities outside Israel. But typically, Israel then says, well, with regard to all the other issues, we can work those out later. It implies that it will be reasonable, but it never is. And so we have already seen, the news has just broken that apparently the Biden administration, in order to get this agreement, gave Israel permission to restart the war whenever it wants. So basically what we have is a brief pause in Israel's genocide. not a real ceasefire. And we also don't know what sweetener Mr. Witkoff, the representative of President-elect Trump, may have offered to Netanyahu to compensate for whatever tough love he gave him. It's entirely possible that he committed the United States under Trump to join in an attack on Iran, for example, which is something that Netanyahu really wants. In return for making concessions on Gaza. And the final point I'd make here is that Netanyahu's war cabinet and his cabinet in general are dominated by religious Zionists who are committed to the expansion of Israeli territory and to the removal or extermination of its Palestinian inhabitants. So the cabinet, in approving the so-called deal, that is the pause in the fighting, during which some hostages will be exchanged, the cabinet also authorized a major expansion of the ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank. So I think there's a real question now, what is Mr. Trump going to do? He might very well feel, as his predecessors have, that he's been taken to the cleaners by Netanyahu, that Netanyahu has duped him, and that he has been betrayed by Netanyahu. So I don't know what he's going to do. I'm not sure that he knows. But there is much less to this so-called deal than a lot of pundits have been saying. It's basically just a few-week pause in the fighting, if that. And finally, I just note that we don't have an accurate picture of what has been going on, in part because the press has been excluded completely from Gaza. So we know that the actual death count for Palestinians is more likely close to 200,000 or so than the 47,000 that have been reported. We also know that there have been 120,000 or so wounded on the Palestinian side in a situation where there is no medical care because the Israelis have systematically destroyed it. Israeli casualties, the deaths, have been relatively few, maybe less than 500 over the course of the 16 months or so of this campaign of annihilation against the Palestinians. But there have been over 40,000 wounded. The low number of deaths reflects the fact that modern medicine is much better at saving lives than in previous wars. It also reflects the fact that Israel's fighting only a few miles from its own hospitals. So it can medically evacuate the wounded and give them treatment. But there is a very large unknown number out of that 40,000 who have been disabled, whose lives have been ruined. And the IDF also, the Israeli Defense Forces, also point to the fact that a huge number of Israelis have now got mental problems as a result of what they participated in and did in Gaza. So this isn't over, and we do not have a good picture of what is likely to happen.
Coming back to the question that I had, why did the Biden administration not try to convince Netanyahu to go after some sort of ceasefire? Here is what Joe Biden said on MSNBC days after October 7th and the meeting he had with Netanyahu.
I went to Israel immediately after their attack by Hamas, 8 days later, whatever it was. And I told him we were going to help. And I said, but Bibi, I said, you can't be carpet bombing these communities. And he said to me, well, you did it. You carpet bombed, not his exact words, but you carpet bombed Berlin. You dropped a nuclear weapon. You killed thousands of innocent people because you had to in order to win a war. I said, but that's why we came up with the UN. New deals by which what we would do relative to civilians and military.
So he was comparing 21st century war tactics, battle tactics, with World War II.
Well, what he was really doing is he was going after me for saying you can't indiscriminately bomb civilian areas, even if the bad guys are there. Even if the bad guys there, you can't take out 2, 10, 12, 1,500 people, innocent people, in order to get the one bad guy. And he made a legitimate argument. His perspective said, look, these are the guys that kill my people. These are the guys that are all over in these tunnels. Nobody had any idea the miles of tunnels were down there. It's amazing what they built.
Yeah, he said he made a legitimate argument. Why does the United States president not know how to respond to these manipulative arguments?
I think that's a question that a lot of historians are going to be very interested in. I think Mr. Biden has shown on multiple occasions that he has very poor judgment. This is very poor judgment indeed. What he has done effectively over the last 16 months is destroy the entire fabric of international law, destroy the credibility of the UN Charter and the United Nations, which he referred to, destroy the laws of war. He has aided and abetted, not just condoned, he has aided and abetted genocide, while his Secretary of State and his National Security Advisor deny that there is genocide. They think there's genocide in Xinjiang in China, where people are being re-educated and forcibly assimilated, much as the United States did and Canada did and Australia did with indigenous people. That is a crime, I agree. That is bad behavior, but it is not genocide by any definition. They have announced there is genocide in Sudan. Why? Basically, because they want to be on, quote, the right side of history, unquote. But they are entirely on the wrong side of history in the case of Israel and Palestine. And this is not going to be Mr. Biden's legacy, when it's judged by historians, will carry this very, very dark mark on it. And I would note finally, Nima, that as an American, I'm disgusted with this kind of posture on the part of our government. But I'm far from alone. All of the polls show that young Americans, in particular, young Jewish Americans, overwhelmingly believe there is genocide being committed in Gaza and don't want to be associated with it. The American people oppose the weapons sales to Israel, or weapons gifts to Israel, more accurately, that Biden has carried out. Now, having said all of that, I don't see much prospect of an improvement under Mr. Trump. He may react viscerally to the essential betrayal of him and his envoy by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He may be angry. He does have a habit of getting angry at people who don't follow his direction. And that might lead him to do something by way of pressure on Israel. But otherwise, he's been, he's the one who illegally recognized the incorporation of the Golan Heights into Israel. He's the one who moved the embassy to Jerusalem in total contradiction to international law and repeated Security Council decisions. He has no respect for precedents, for rules. He is emotional and he acts on the basis of his gut, not his brain sometimes. So we can't tell what he will do. It would be hard to be worse than Joe Biden. But if anyone could achieve that, it would be Donald Trump.
And when you look at the current state of the relationship in the Middle East, do you think that Donald Trump, many people are arguing right now that the main goal of Donald Trump is getting back to Abraham Accord between between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Is that the case right now in the mind of Trump and his administration?
I don't know what he's thinking. I think it's too early to make that judgment. Obviously, he took great pride in the Abraham Accords. But let's remember the essence of the Abraham Accords was an effort, with an attempt, apparently successful at the time, to set the Palestinian self-determination issue aside, to bypass it, to leave it as something that can't be discussed, and distract attention by building a normal relationship for Israel in the Middle East. Israel is very peculiar. Its mentality, the way it thinks, it wants to be European, but it's situated in the middle of West Asia. It has no relationship that is anything but cold or hateful with any of its neighbors, and it is not prepared to coexist with the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. So the prospects, the Abraham Accords were quite an achievement. They were basically led by the United Arab Emirates, which is a classically realpolitik practicing country, totally practical, and it saw benefits in this. But don't forget, it also demanded, and Israel appeared to imply, that it would agree to a halt in settlements in the West Bank. The exact opposite happened. So again, this is the typical Israeli pattern. Accept something for short-term benefit, promise things in the longer term, and then don't deliver them. And what has happened since Mr. Trump left office, among other things, is this war with, I hate to call it a war because it's an annihilation. It's a massacre. It's genocide of the Palestinians. And this has horrified everyone in the world outside a few countries in the collective West, which are committed to Israel, regardless of what it does. So if you run a poll anywhere in the Arab world or in Iran or anywhere in the Islamic world, you would find nobody approves of the Abraham Accords. And they are basically on life support. And there are severe limits to what the Saudi government under Mohammed bin Salman can do with Israel when his public is utterly 99% opposed to doing anything with Israel. And it all comes back. I remember my deputy in Riyadh when I was ambassador there, before I arrived, had a conversation with the late King Abdullah, then the Crown Prince, and he asked him to do something, and Abdullah's response was, "Well, a friend who doesn't help you is no better than an enemy who does you no harm. So the United States is a friend, so I will do this thing, even though I don't think it makes sense." Later, I was present when Abdullah was talking to a group of advocates for Israel. And they kept saying, you have to do something nice for Israel, and the Israelis then will do something nice back, which is not anything that has any evidence behind it. But anyway, it sounded good. And Abdullah finally said, "I have a message for your Israeli friends." He said, "Tell them, if they want to be loved, they should do something lovable. Well, if they want to be hated, they should do something hateful. And they have done the most hateful things of anyone in the 21st century. They have replicated exactly everything minus the gas chambers, what was done to European Jews by the Nazis. And the world sees this and is horrified by the sadism, the cruelty that has been on evidence and has been presented to the International Criminal Court, is being used to track down individual Israeli soldiers who are guilty of crimes against humanity, participating in genocide. Things have changed. It was once possible to accept Israel as a reality, regardless of its amorality. That is not easy now. So I think this may very well be a Trump desire. And I think in the end, Israel in the long run, if it's going to survive, has to, and not go the way of the little Christian kingdoms 800 years ago or so. It is going to have to make peace with its neighbors. It's going to have to come to grips with the issue of coexisting with the Palestinians. It shows no sign of wanting to do that. Therefore, I think its long-term existence is in jeopardy, and Mr. Netanyahu has done more than anyone else to create that situation, which I deplore. There are many decent people in Israel who are Jewish Israelis. He's put them in danger. He's also put international Jewish communities in danger, because to the extent that the world's Jews are seen to be automatic supporters of genocide, of cruelties, of raping prisoners, of raping women, of the sorts of things that Israel has been proven to carry out, that leads to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in the West, at least, was a sort of an undercurrent that had not entirely disappeared. But there's an upsurge now, and it's all due to what Israel is doing.
So let's get started with what's going on in the Middle East, a ceasefire. After more than a year, here is what Haaretz reported in Israel, that Trump forced Netanyahu to accept the deal. And when it comes to the importance of this new attitude on the part of the administration in the United States, we don't know yet who is mostly responsible for this peace talks. But many people, as Haaretz pointed out, are saying that Donald Trump is behind this. And many people may remember those days in 1981 with Carter and Reagan, with the hostages in Iran. And Reagan came to power on January 20th. The hostages were released by the Iranian government in those days. What's the importance of these days that we're living, Richard, in terms of what's going on in Gaza?
Well, I mean, there are many ways to read this. I think Haaretz is right. I think that will be the judgment of history. You can't possibly imagine that the arrival of a new president is just coincidentally connected with this decision to have a ceasefire. So it clearly is not something that Biden did because he couldn't do it for the whole history of the war is a history of miscalculation. They weren't ready to prevent it. They weren't ready to deal with it. They weren't ready to work out an accommodation. They blocked it from the earliest meetings in February of 2022, when the war had just begun and they were meeting. We all know about these meetings now because of what was said. We know about the whole buildup toward the war. Angela Merkel made it crystal clear, and others have corroborated it. So the bottom line is that Mr. Trump was prepared through his emissary, Mr. Witkoff. He was prepared to say what everybody knew Mr. Biden could have said at any point. Or to make it more accurate, Mr. Biden said all kinds of things, but he didn't do anything. The bottom line is Israel could not have such a war without the money and the weapons provided by the United States. If at any time a serious threat to the Israelis, including Mr. Netanyahu, a serious threat to withdraw the money and or the weapons, and you would have gotten this decision. And therefore, and the history will make this judgment whether we do or not, the complicity of the United States in what Israel did in Gaza is hereby established. I mean, most of us understood it already, but here it's crystal clear. Whatever the words were Israel understood that the new president would not hesitate to do what the old president repeatedly hesitated to do. And that made all the difference, as most of us understood. In the larger historical frame, let me go further. Israel as a society made the decision through many years and many different governments to hitch its wagon, to make its bed with the United States, to become dependent upon the United States in virtually every major way. Militarily, for sure, financially, for sure, and politically, right down to the most recent United Nations votes, which had weird numbers like 120 countries on one side, a dozen in the middle, and the United States and Israel virtually alone. I mean, you have achieved over time not just a close alliance, but you achieved utter isolation. And that's not going to go away, because the kind of warfare undertaken in Gaza makes all of that worse, makes it last longer, makes it run deeper. And you're going to see, I'm sure, over the months and years ahead, since this ceasefire is just that, it's not a solution to the war, it is an agreement not to continue fighting for a while. You're going to see very active efforts on the part of all of the Middle East, all the Arab countries, allied with all the Islamic countries, allied with all their supporters inside the BRICS and outside as well. And that's going to keep up the isolation, keep up the difficulty. Israel has hooked its future, as it has hooked its past, on the United States. But here's the key problem. The United States, as Michael and I have been discussing with you, Nima, for months now, the United States empire is declining, shrinking, dying, if you like. And American capitalism has got an accumulation of problems. Not the least of those problems are so severe that the only reaction the country has is to deny it. So we just had a presidential election in which neither Mr. Trump, nor Biden, nor Kamala Harris said a word about a declining empire, said a word about an accumulation of economic problems that really are historic, long-lasting, long-building. Instead, they engaged in what passes for politics in this country is the theater of blaming each other as if one or the other party were the problem instead of one and the other party being the problem. So I think what we have reached is a historical shift. The United States, in trying to cope with the problems it denies it has, is prepared to throw Israel under the bus. It was something that could have and should have been understood from the beginning. There were other paths for Israel to follow. It could have related to its own Arab community. Let's all remember Israel, roughly speaking, is a country of 7 million Arabs and 7 million Jews. And there's a complicated way of trying to work such a society. It has been accomplished in other countries. It does not have to mean endless warfare. That's a silly idea. There are alternatives. They didn't pursue them, or at least the dominant forces in Israel. To Israel's credit, they have always had an opposition. They have one now. Haaretz is part of that opposition that you have just shown us, that clip. But the dominant politics of that country made them have an alliance which they have never really questioned and which is now confronting them with what it means to be the very junior partner to an alliance with an enormously powerful country that is losing the power that made you ally with them in the first place. This reality is going to have to be faced, no matter how long it's covered over with political noise of the sort we're going to be seeing a lot of in the weeks ahead.
Well, Richard has said pretty much anything that I could have said about that. I guess there are a couple of questions. Why has Israel depended so much on the United States? It's not only because the United States Zionists have given hundreds of millions of dollars of support to the Zionist charge, but it's also because Israel is allowed to bribe politicians, Congress, lawmakers in the United States in a way that it can't do in any other country because of Citizens United. Citizen United has privatized the political process here and said it's okay to have your policies decided by your donors. And all Israel has to do is ask for Congress for money, send part of the money back to the congressional campaigns, and it's a circular flow. And that has essentially bought Congress. But what you're saying, Richard, is, well, Trump is not Congress. Trump is an entirely different situation. He has got $100 million from Sheldon Adelson's wife to support Israel. What can Trump say? He can say, well, of course I support Israel, but I don't support Netanyahu. And he's had a lot of problems with Netanyahu, as have the Israeli citizens as a whole. And so that's one issue. It's all going to come down, as Richard points out, is after the inauguration at the beginning of next week, is Trump going to continue to authorize the shipping of bombs and military support to Israel? And in fact, will he have the power over the army to really stop this? Well, the problem is that next week is only the first day of his administration. What he said he's going to do is end the independence of the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI to essentially disobey the orders that the executive branch gives to it. How long will it take him to actually enforce that? And is there any enforceability? And everything that we're talking about in Israel and the Ukraine comes down to enforceability. Agreements are easy to make. Netanyahu has already said, we'll sign any agreement you want, but we're not going to follow it. We're going to do whatever I want. And what I want is what the Israeli people want. We want to kill everyone in Israel who is not Jewish. We want to kill, this is a race war. It's a civilizational war. We consider the Gazians, as we've said, to be subhumans, and God told us to kill him. Our agreement, we have a covenant with God. That's our agreement. And no agreement that we make with Arab countries who we do not respect, or with the United States, is stronger than our covenant with God to murder all the non-Israelis here so we can have a truly religious, God-fearing state. That's the mentality that we're dealing with. And in a way, you could say this has a parallel with what Trump has promised to do at the beginning of his administration with Ukraine. How can Ukraine feels exactly the same way? It doesn't matter what kind of agreement they've made. They've made agreements in the past with Russia. They have their constitutional statement of how Ukraine is supposed to be. We're back down to the enforcement issue, and we're in an era now where there's really no such thing as enforceable international law. And that means that almost all the agreements that we're talking about are meant to sound good without any intention of following through. The kind of agreements that the newspapers were talking about yesterday about Israel stopping bombing Gaza is exactly what happened just before President Obama took office. They all made the same promise. He took office, then immediately they began bombing Gaza again. So I'm not optimistic that the bombing is going to stop. I think that the Israeli parties are already have said they're not supporting Netanyahu if he does live up to the agreement with the United States and does not kill does not kill all the Palestinians. That's the mentality we're dealing with, and I don't know how there can be a solution under that kind of a situation.
Well, it would be very dangerous. I mean, I understand everything you're saying, but it would be very dangerous at this point for all of the players, including Mr. Trump, if nothing happens. It will make him look like what you just said. It will expose him to being a theatrical prop who goes through the same agreement, Camp David, all of that, with no outcome, with purely distractive window dressing to avoid dealing with the problem. And for a new president who wants to establish and whose whole political career is, I am different from the convention, the Bush, the Clinton, the Obama, I'm not them. Look at how I talk. Look at who I gather around me. Look at who I choose to be in my cabinet. I'm not them. I'm the common man. I'm the, this is not new in history, this play acting at a populism. The Republicans present themselves as something fundamentally different from Democrats. They've tried that for years. They're running out of gas with that, as are the Democrats. And so you need a refresher. Mr. Trump is a refresher. He's really different, you see, from the others. He isn't, of course, any more than they were different from one another in being cheerleaders for capitalism, which is what they each compete with the other to be. And he isn't any different from that. However, he understands that their game, I'm different from one another, is the game to play. And for him, therefore, he's different from both of them. He rejects the conventional Republicans. He rejects the Democrats almost with equal fervor, with equal intensity. And he sets himself up as a de facto third party trying to hold on to the same political regime that the two parties always did. Except I'm new and I'm different, which is what each of the presidential candidates tried to say, and most Americans could care less.